I walked into the restaurant expecting the soft hum of polite chatter and the gentle clinking of cutlery. Nothing more. Birthdays had always been quiet affairs for me. Intimate moments I preferred without fanfare or expectation. But the moment I stepped through the door, a tight knot formed in my stomach. My ex-husband was already seated at the far end of the table, smiling that smug, self-satisfied grin that never failed to remind me of all the years he had underestimated me. I forced myself to breathe, reminding myself this was my day, even if he had to be present. My daughter slid into the booth beside me, her eyes sparkling with mischief, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Leaning closer, she whispered, "While I distract him," and a shiver ran down my spine. I had learned long ago not to underestimate her, or myself. Something was brewing, and I could feel it before a word was spoken. The waiter brought menus, and I made small talk, all the while watching the subtle shifts in body language across the table, catching the way my ex's gaze flicked toward us, unaware of the quiet storm forming. I let my thoughts wander for a moment, replaying memories of birthdays past, each one tinged with disappointment, each one a reminder of the careful diplomacy I had always practiced. Now something was different. The air between us felt charged, as if a single word, a single glance, could ignite events that had been simmering for years. My daughter's whisper echoed in my mind, a reminder of the loyalty and cunning I had nurtured in her, a spark of hope that this time, the tables would turn. I smiled faintly, feeling the weight of anticipation settle around me, a mixture of dread and excitement coiling in my chest. Every gesture, every laugh, every small comment could be a thread leading toward revelation, and I was ready to follow it wherever it went. The quiet lunch was no longer just a celebration. It was the opening move in a game that had been decades in the making, and I intended to play it well. I couldn't help but let my mind drift back as I stirred my coffee, memories pressing in like an unwelcome tide. Birthdays had never been easy with him, but it wasn't just birthdays. It was every family gathering, every milestone, every moment that should have been mine to enjoy. He had a way of making his favoritism obvious, handing praise to my siblings while barely sparing a glance in my direction. I remembered my college graduation, how he barely spoke a word of congratulations, yet gushed over my brother's minor accomplishments as if they were monumental. It wasn't subtle. It was deliberate, a pattern I had grown painfully aware of over the years, and the little manipulations, they'd been relentless. Subtly undermining me in front of relatives, spreading doubts about my choices, questioning my judgment at every opportunity. I had thought I was imagining it at first, questioning my own perception, but the evidence piled up until it was undeniable. Every slight, every dismissive comment, every veiled insult was a reminder of his need to control, to assert dominance, to maintain the illusion that he knew better than everyone else. I remembered my first apartment, the way he scoffed at my efforts to furnish it modestly yet stylishly, comparing it unfavorably to my sister's luxurious condo. I remembered family vacations where he would openly ignore my presence, choosing instead to praise my brother for the tiniest gestures, while my accomplishments were minimized or erased entirely. It had left scars, deep and lingering, shaping my sense of self and fueling an underlying anger that I had buried for years. Yet amidst all of it, I had learned to watch, to listen, to prepare. Every slight became a lesson, every underestimation a hidden advantage. And now, sitting here years later, I realized those betrayals weren't just wounds. They were the blueprint for what was about to unfold. The quiet tension in the restaurant, my daughter's mischievous whisper, and the smirk of my ex across the table, all felt like pieces of a puzzle finally coming together. The past wasn't just a memory anymore. It was a strategy waiting to be enacted, a silent promise that the years of neglect, favoritism, and undermining were about to meet their reckoning. As the appetizer arrived, my daughter leaned closer again, her lips barely moving as she murmured, "Just wait. While I distract him, you'll see." I suppressed a chuckle, both at her enthusiasm and at the way she clearly thought I wasn't already 3 steps ahead. My mind raced, tracing the threads of what she could possibly be planning. She had always been clever, too clever for her age sometimes. But in this moment, I realized she had no idea that I had already orchestrated several contingencies of my own. The thrill of shared mischief coursed through me, the kind that only comes when you know a secret your opponent can't yet grasp. I sipped my drink, letting my gaze drift over my ex-husband, who was completely unaware, absorbed in his own sense of superiority. The dual-layered suspense was intoxicating, the obvious distraction she was about to employ, and the hidden strategy I had laid, perfectly timed, waiting to spring into action. I reminded myself of past lessons. Never underestimate the underestimated. I caught the flicker of pride in her eyes, her anticipation of her own cleverness, and it made me smile inwardly. This lunch was no longer just a celebration. It had transformed into a stage, with us controlling every act, every move. The air between us was charged, and I could feel the first hints of the coming unraveling. The game was in motion, the pieces aligned, and the thrill of impending justice settled in my chest. The moment the plates arrived, the tension at the table became almost tangible. My ex-husband leaned back in his chair, that familiar, smug expression plastered across his face, as if the world revolved entirely around his version of it. "I hope they didn't serve this at your last gathering," he said casually, eyes flicking toward my daughter. The comment was light on the surface, but the sting was unmistakable. I smiled politely, letting him think he'd landed a hit, then calmly replied, "It's fine, actually. Everyone seems to be enjoying it." My tone was measured, almost effortless, masking the satisfaction I felt at diffusing his subtle jab. My daughter's eyes met mine, a silent, "You see?" sparkling between us. Around the table, relatives noticed the tension. The way he nudged the conversation toward belittling my achievements didn't go unnoticed. Whispered comments and subtle side glances betrayed their awareness. He continued, "I didn't realize you were handling this by yourself." A thinly veiled criticism of my choice to plan the lunch, assuming I couldn't manage without his input. I countered with a light laugh. "I've done it before, and it usually turns out well." The statement both humble and pointed, leaving him without a retort. The small reversal was satisfying. His attempt to assert dominance had been neutralized, though he didn't realize I had much more in store. I could feel my daughter's excitement building beside me, her hand briefly brushing mine as if to say, "Watch him squirm." Every comment he made, every glance he threw, became a thread I could pull to tighten the noose of tension. The air felt heavier now, charged with anticipation. We were dancing around his ego, feeding just enough attention to keep him unaware of how firmly we controlled the table. This was the first subtle victory, a quiet reversal of roles, but I knew the real reckoning had yet to come. As I glanced at my daughter across the table, I was flooded with memories of the bond we'd forged over the years. A bond forged in quiet defiance and unspoken understanding. From the moment she could walk, she had instinctively sensed when he tried to diminish me, when his favoritism and cold dismissals cut deeper than words. I remembered the afternoons spent helping her with homework, while he criticized my every decision, whispering that I was overreacting or too sensitive in front of others. She would tug at my sleeve, eyes wide, a small hand anchored in mine, silently pledging, "I'm on your side." Those moments had built a fortress between us, a loyalty neither distance nor his manipulations could break. I recalled the time he tried to claim she should spend weekends exclusively with him, dismissing my sacrifices, the nights I stayed awake after double shifts, missing meals and rest, just to keep her safe and grounded. Every small injustice, being ignored at school meetings, having my input dismissed at family events, being belittled in front of neighbors, had been a lesson in patience, strategy, and quiet resilience. My daughter had grown up witnessing my endurance, my refusal to crumble despite the emotional weight he imposed. She learned that strength wasn't loud. It was deliberate, calculated, and unwavering. Our shared history was not just about survival. It was about learning how to reclaim dignity, how to recognize the patterns of manipulation, and how to wait for the perfect moment to assert ourselves. Sitting here now, watching her confidence and mischief align with mine, I felt a profound mixture of pride and anticipation. This lunch wasn't just a meal. It was the culmination of years of silent preparation, a shared understanding that when the time came, we would move as one, and finally, justice would taste sweet. As conversation flowed, he launched another subtle attack, a sly remark disguised as casual banter. I hope you remembered to invite everyone who matters this time. The comment dripped with condescension, meant to make me feel small in front of family and friends. I let the words hang in the air for a heartbeat, then smiled warmly, leaning slightly closer to my daughter as if sharing a private joke. Of course, I said lightly. I made sure everyone who's important to me is here, and I think it's exactly how it should be. His eyes flickered with surprise, just for a moment, and I knew I had intercepted his attempt to manipulate the room. That small, quiet victory felt delicious, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it revealed how little he understood about the depth of my planning. I could feel the tension rising, a subtle charge that made every glance and gesture more meaningful. He had assumed he controlled the narrative, that I would react predictably, but he had underestimated me entirely. I caught my daughter's eye across the table, and her barely perceptible smile mirrored my own satisfaction. We had turned a tiny moment into a demonstration of quiet power, and it was only the beginning. Every subtle word, every measured reaction, now carried the weight of the larger plan we had carefully set in motion. He might have thought he was in control, but the audience, and we, knew the real payoff was coming, and it would be far greater than he could ever anticipate. My daughter shifted slightly in her seat, her movements casual but deliberate, a small hand gesture here, a whispered comment there, all perfectly timed. I watched her carefully, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of my lips. She had learned well, how to plant seeds of distraction without revealing her full intent, how to bait him into revealing his arrogance without him realizing it. Across the table, he responded exactly as expected, leaning forward, puffing his chest, attempting to dominate the conversation with self-important anecdotes and thinly veiled criticisms. Every laugh, every nod he offered was a tiny misstep, and I quietly guided the flow, interjecting just enough to steer the interaction toward exposure. The contrast was intoxicating. He saw a child, underestimated her, assumed innocence, while she skillfully orchestrated the first layers of his unraveling. I could almost hear the thoughts in my head. Let him think he's winning. Watch him crumble when the final act arrives. Each moment of subtle manipulation reinforced our control over the table, and I felt a surge of pride in her cleverness, in how our combined patience and strategy were turning the tide. She was underestimated, yes, but brilliantly so, and I reveled in the way his arrogance was setting itself up for a fall, one carefully constructed by both of us. They thought the plan belonged only to my daughter, a bright-eyed distraction designed to embarrass a man who had made arrogance his armor. That assumption was the misdirection, the delicious part of the play. While she moved like a subtle performer across the table, planting little provocations, I had already built the stage and the backstage machinery. Years of being overlooked taught me to craft patience into strategy. I had not relied on a single trick. I had arranged 1,000 small contingencies to align at the precise moment. It began months earlier with quiet, unglamorous work. I recorded conversations he didn't realize were on the line, saved messages where he promised support, and then walked away, and collected correspondence that contradicted the confident persona he'd paraded. I reached out to people he thought would never speak against him. Neighbors, former colleagues, a few estranged relatives, and listened as they recalled details he assumed were private. Each memory they shared became a small stone in a wall I was building, each recollection a notch that eventually would hold weight. I made practical moves too. I discreetly coordinated with someone at the restaurant to have specific guests seated close enough to overhear a key exchange. I arranged for a cousin who had quietly suffered his condescension to be present that afternoon. I scheduled a call to interrupt his rehearsed retorts at the precise moment he might try to redirect attention. I had even prepared a document, a small ledger of decisions, promises, and receipts, placed in a folder that would surface like a relic at the right second. These were not dramatic gestures. They were precise, silent levers. This was not about cruelty. It was corrective. I kept remembering the small, corrosive humiliations. The nights I covered late bills because he'd promised to. The public gatherings where he turned my contributions into punchlines. The whispered doubts he seeded about my competence until I began to doubt myself. Those moments hardened into resolve. The kind of revenge I favored was surgical, not theatrical. One that used careful exposure instead of shouting. I wanted him to stand uncovered by his own habits, and to see in real time how his curated image could not withstand the accumulation of ordinary facts. As the lunch progressed, I watched him perform. He gave us his usual bravado, spinning half-truths into boasts. Each exaggeration fed the choreography I had laid out for him. My daughter tugged at a loose thread by asking an innocent question. He answered with a flourish, revealing a contradiction I had documented. A relative nearby leaned in and asked for clarification on a business venture he'd described, an inquiry that landed like a pebble into still water and sent ripples across his confident surface. A server, who had been quietly given a precise cue, produced a receipt with dates he could not reconcile. Little things compounded into an undeniable pattern. I felt a steady warmth of vindication that was less about triumph and more about balance restored. Watching him compress under the weight of ordinary facts was quietly satisfying. He tried to steer the narrative back, to laugh and charm his way out of it, but the careful architecture of evidence made evasion clumsy. People who had once endured his small cruelties without comment started speaking in fragments, then whole sentences, their voices knitting together into a chorus that recentered the truth. The spotlight was not loud. It was steady and illuminating. At one point, he searched for my reaction, that reflexive glance he expected from years of habit. He was looking for the old me, the compliant partner who smoothed over things. I met his eyes with something else, calm, composed, and unmistakably prepared. In that look, there was the unspoken revelation that this had been arranged, that the scene had a director, and that director was not him. The table had shifted, and what remained was the quiet, inevitable movement toward a public unmasking. The final act was aligning with the cues my daughter had placed, and truth would have its last undeniable say now. By the time dessert arrived, the tension was nearly unbearable. A taut thread stretched across the table. My ex-husband leaned back, clearly sensing that something was off, his eyes darting nervously between my daughter and me. "I don't understand," he said, voice tight, "how all of this happened?" He gestured vaguely toward the scattered receipts, the inconsistencies in his stories, and the quiet murmurs of relatives exchanging glances. I allowed a small, measured smile to spread across my face, deliberately calm, deliberately unthreatening. "Oh, it's quite simple," I said, my voice steady but carrying a subtle edge. "We just paid attention. All these little details you thought no one noticed, they add up." His brow furrowed, confusion turning to disbelief. My daughter leaned forward slightly, whispering to him with mock innocence. "I told you, Dad. We were distracted, but you forgot who built it." The words landed like a hammer, and I saw the realization dawn in his eyes. He opened his mouth to argue, to deflect, but the ledger and printed messages now circulating on the table cut him off before he could speak. Relatives who had silently suffered his condescension over the years began to voice the truths he had ignored. "Wait, you promised me that," one cousin said, holding up an email. "But here it says otherwise." Another chimed in. I remember him saying something completely different at the meeting, shaking her head, disbelief and vindication blending on her face. His smug confidence crumbled like sand through fingers. He sputtered, attempted weak jokes, tried to redirect the blame, but every attempt only revealed further contradictions. The crowd, previously silent, now bore witness to a pattern of arrogance, manipulation, and deceit that could no longer be hidden. I don't, he stammered, voice cracking, his dominance evaporating under the weight of accumulated truth. The contrast was stark. The man who had once held every conversation, every room, every gathering under his control was now exposed, vulnerable, humbled, and silent. The shock twist emerged subtly but powerfully. What had seemed like a minor distraction, my daughter's clever interjection, her whispered plan, was the catalyst. It revealed not just his arrogance, but the entirety of his manipulative patterns. Each lie, each slight, each attempt to diminish us now came to light, amplified by the combined force of observation, planning, and patience. His face flushed, his words failed him, and for the first time, the room saw him as he truly was, fallible, small, and utterly unprepared for the consequences of underestimating us. I watched quietly, savoring the moment, allowing him to feel the full weight of exposure. The humiliation was public, unmistakable, and complete. The reversal was total. He who had always sought to control and belittle was now powerless, his credibility shredded in plain view. My daughter and I exchanged a glance, the satisfaction of shared triumph simmering between us. And I realized the real power had never been his. It had always been ours. The aftermath of the confrontation settled over the table like a slow, heavy fog. My ex-husband's face, once a mask of confidence and entitlement, now carried the weight of public embarrassment. The subtle smirks and side glances of relatives and friends that had been restrained moments ago now became impossible to ignore. Invitations he had once assumed unquestioned, family events, social gatherings, even business circles, were quietly rescinded, whispered among people who had finally seen his true character. I noticed a cousin decline his customary handshake, a colleague politely retract an offer to collaborate, and neighbors who had once courted his attention now avoiding eye contact. Each micro-rejection, each social slight, compounded into an invisible avalanche that left him cornered and humbled. Financially, the cracks were beginning to show as well. Unbeknownst to him, I had quietly alerted certain parties to inconsistencies in his claims, investments he had boasted about, transactions he had exaggerated, favors he had misrepresented. Calls and questions arrived while we ate, subtle inquiries that signaled he could no longer operate behind a veneer of wealth and influence without scrutiny. He tried to joke, to laugh, to salvage pride, but each attempt was met with polite detachment, awkward glances, or polite corrections that made him appear smaller with every passing moment. Through it all, I remained calm, composed, savoring the contrast between his scrambling and my steady satisfaction. I watched him flounder, realizing that the man who had spent decades attempting to control and belittle others was now exposed, diminished, and isolated. The power dynamics had shifted completely. His status no longer elevated him, and my composure underscored the truth that the consequences he now faced were fully earned. I could feel the weight of justice settling around us, quiet but absolute, as if the universe itself had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. In that moment, I experienced a deep sense of catharsis, knowing that years of careful observation, strategic patience, and subtle orchestration had culminated in this unassailable vindication. The table, once tense and constrained by his ego, now felt lighter, freer, and filled with quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served. Not loudly, not aggressively, but with the kind of deliberate, unwavering precision that left no room for argument. I leaned back slightly, a small smile playing across my lips, as the contrast framed itself perfectly. His downfall stark against my quiet triumph, his panic against my serene composure. The lesson was clear, and it resonated deeply. Underestimation was a dangerous miscalculation, and patience, preparation, and loyalty could achieve what arrogance never could. After the commotion had settled, and the last echoes of disbelief faded, my daughter reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. It was a small gesture, but in it lay years of shared struggles, whispered strategies, and quiet resilience. I looked into her eyes and saw the same mixture of pride and relief that mirrored my own. A recognition that we had done what seemed impossible, not with anger, but with patience and cleverness. The room felt lighter now, as if the air itself acknowledged the reversal that had just occurred. I reflected on how far we had come. The countless moments of being dismissed, underestimated, or ignored had taught us to observe, to wait, and to act when the timing was right. That patience had become our strength, our invisible weapon against arrogance and cruelty. As we exchanged quiet smiles, I felt a sense of empowerment I had never experienced so fully. It wasn't just about defeating him. It was about reclaiming dignity, about proving to ourselves that endurance and strategy could triumph over manipulation and entitlement. I thought of all the small sacrifices I had made, the silent compromises, the nights I had worried while maintaining composure in front of family and friends. Each memory now seemed like a necessary stepping stone to this moment of victory. My daughter's loyalty and cleverness had been a reminder that strength could be nurtured, that intelligence and patience could form an unbreakable alliance. Together, we had orchestrated a quiet triumph that no one could diminish, a victory rooted not in spectacle, but in careful orchestration and deep understanding of human nature. In that soft, reflective pause, I felt the emotional weight lift, replaced by the warmth of shared accomplishment and the knowledge that justice, even subtle and quiet, could leave a lasting mark. Just as I thought the day's lessons had settled, he tried one last move, a clumsy attempt at redemption, a public declaration meant to restore some semblance of pride. He smiled too widely, words rehearsed but hollow, praising my daughter for her cleverness and claiming he never meant to undermine anyone. The problem was, his timing and delivery only made him look more desperate. People exchanged subtle, knowing glances, whispers rippling across the table. The ledger, the emails, the witnesses, it all still hung in the air, a silent indictment that his words could not erase. I watched him falter, eyes darting nervously, realizing that the very effort meant to redeem him only reinforced the truth of his arrogance. My daughter, seated beside me, let out a quiet, satisfied sigh, her earlier cleverness amplified by his failed maneuver. I felt a deep sense of justice settle in, knowing that years of underestimation had left him trapped by his own miscalculations. Even in trying to recover, he had underestimated our patience, our foresight, and the unshakable bond that had guided every move. The subtle twist left everyone at the table with a lingering sense of awe. The audience of family and friends witnessed not just exposure, but the impossibility of repairing a reputation built on consistent disregard for others. I realized that true vindication wasn't loud. It was the quiet acknowledgement that the person who underestimated you would continue to stumble, while we remained composed, empowered, and untouchable. The lingering suspense, paired with undeniable moral justice, created a satisfaction that was both sharp and sweet. The final word had been spoken, and it belonged entirely to us. As the restaurant emptied and the last clatter of dishes faded, I sat back and let the weight of the afternoon settle. There was no need for grand gestures or dramatic speeches. The story had already spoken for itself. My daughter leaned against me, a quiet warmth in her presence that reminded me how far we had come together. I reflected on the journey, the years of subtle manipulation, the dismissals, the favoritism, the careful observation that had taught us patience and strategic thinking. Every slight, every injustice we had endured had prepared us for this moment of quiet empowerment. I felt vindicated not just by the exposure of his arrogance, but by the knowledge that our actions had been measured, deliberate, and deeply just. I thought about the loyalty that had carried us through, the unspoken bond between mother and daughter, forged in moments of quiet resistance and shared wisdom. That loyalty was our secret strength, the thread that had held us together when everything else seemed uncertain. And yet, the reflection wasn't purely triumphant. There was a bittersweet undertone, a recognition of the scars left behind by years of neglect and condescension. The audience could feel it too, the satisfaction of seeing justice served, tempered by the empathy for a family fractured by imbalance. In that reflective pause, I realized the true victory wasn't the humiliation of another, but the reclamation of dignity, the affirmation that patience, intelligence, and loyalty could triumph over arrogance and cruelty. As the sun dipped lower outside, casting a warm glow across the empty restaurant, I allowed myself a deep, unguarded breath, savoring the equilibrium we had restored. The lesson lingered. Underestimation has consequences. Strategic resilience is a quiet power, and family bonds, when nurtured, can withstand even the harshest storms. As we left the restaurant, walking into the fading afternoon light, I felt a mixture of triumph and melancholy. Justice had been served, the arrogance exposed, and the subtle satisfaction of seeing truth revealed coursed through me. Yet, beneath that victory lingered the quiet ache of years spent navigating betrayal, favoritism, and disregard. Those scars didn't vanish. They remained etched in memory, a reminder that healing takes more than a single reckoning. My daughter squeezed my hand gently, grounding me in the present, and I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the bond that had carried us through. The day had proven our patience, strategy, and loyalty, and in that, there was empowerment beyond mere vindication. I thought about how easily arrogance could be dismantled when underestimated, how clever planning and quiet observation could turn even the smallest distraction into a decisive advantage. And yet, the bittersweet truth remained. Even when justice prevails, the past shapes who we are and colors the victories we earn. Walking together, I realized that triumph was not just in the humiliation of another, but in the reclaiming of dignity, the reinforcement of family loyalty, and the knowledge that we had acted with intelligence and heart. That balance of satisfaction and reflection left a lingering resonance, a full-circle emotional closure that felt complete, yet profoundly human.